On a mountainside in the Basque Country, a cave entrance sat buried under collapsed rock, sealed away for thousands of years. In 1916, a group of children chasing a game through the woods stumbled onto an opening nobody knew existed. Inside, painted bison, horses, and bears covered the walls, undisturbed for millennia. And beneath those paintings, layers of human bone and stone tools stretched back even further than the art itself. But this cave is only the entrance to a much bigger mystery. It sits inside a country whose people have somehow resisted every invasion, empire, and language that has swept across Europe for thousands of years. And to this day, nobody has ever fully explained how. It was the winter of 1916 in the town of Cortezubi, in the Biscay province of the Basque Country. A group of local boys were out on the slopes of Mount Aranozar, doing nothing more purposeful than what children do in the woods, chasing each other, exploring, following whatever caught their attention next. None of them were looking for history. They were looking for adventure. And somewhere on that mountainside, they found an opening in the rock that none of them had ever noticed before, a dark gap leading down into the hillside itself. They went in, the way curious children do, and came back out having no real idea what they had actually found. Word of the strange opening eventually reached a local composer who happened to be staying nearby that season. He recognized that this might be more than a simple hole in a hill, and he passed the discovery along to regional authorities. That single conversation was the thread that connected a group of wandering children to what would become one of the most important prehistoric sites in the entire Basque Country. The following year, a formal excavation began. It was led by 3 Basque researchers who would go on to define the study of their own region's deep past: Telesforo de Aranzadi, José Miguel de Barandiaran, and Enrique Eguren. These were not outside academics parachuting in to claim a discovery. These were Basque scholars digging into Basque ground, treating the site with the kind of care that comes from genuinely wanting to understand where your own people came from. Barandiaran in particular would spend decades of his life moving between 2 worlds, excavating caves and dolmens on one hand, and recording the living folklore, beliefs, and oral traditions of Basque villages on the other, as if he understood instinctively that the stones and the stories were part of the same continuous thread. As the team worked deeper into the passage, the true scale of what they were dealing with came into focus. At some point, roughly 13,000 years earlier, a section of the mountain above the entrance had given way. Rock and debris had come down and sealed the opening completely, closing off the passage from the outside world entirely. No wind reached it, no water reached it. No animal, and no human being, crossed that threshold again until 3 curious boys stumbled onto a gap in the rubble by pure accident, thousands of years later. Think about what that kind of seal actually means. Whatever was inside that mountain had been locked away, untouched, for a length of time that outlasts nearly every civilization anyone has ever studied. Entire empires rose and disappeared while that chamber sat in absolute darkness and silence, holding whatever had been left there just before the mountain closed its own door. And here is what makes this discovery different from so many others like it. This was not a tomb built to be sealed on purpose, the way a pharaoh's chamber might be constructed and hidden with intention. Nobody planned this. No one stood outside that cave and decided the world should be locked out. The mountain itself made that decision entirely by accident through nothing more dramatic than gravity and time acting on loose stone above a hollow space. And then it simply kept that decision in place for 13,000 years, until an ordinary afternoon of childhood wandering finally undid it. As Aranzadi, Barandiaran, and Eguren pushed further into the passage that first excavation season, they quickly realized this was not going to be a simple, contained discovery. The chamber ahead of them held more than empty stone. It held marks on the walls that, at first glance, seemed almost impossible to believe were genuinely ancient at all. What those excavators were about to uncover would turn out to be only the surface of a story that stretched back even further than anyone standing in that passage could have guessed, and it would take nearly a century of continued research to even begin piecing together exactly how far back it actually went. Deeper inside the sealed chamber, past the point where daylight had any business reaching, the excavation team found the walls covered in marks that were unmistakably deliberate. Nearly 50 individual figures spread across a series of panels in the cave's inner sanctuary, done in two distinct techniques, some rendered in charcoal, others engraved directly into the living stone itself. Bison dominated the collection, more than 30 of them alone, painted in confident black lines across the rock. Alongside them stood a scattering of ibex, a handful of horses caught mid-stride, a solitary bear, and a stag, along with the fragmentary remains of other figures too worn or incomplete to identify with certainty. None of these were large, showy compositions meant to overwhelm a viewer. They were modest in scale, tightly clustered, and by most artistic standards, not especially refined. And that modesty is exactly what makes them so characteristic of the wider Magdalenian tradition, the same broad cultural period responsible for some of the most celebrated painted caves anywhere in Europe. Consider the physical reality of what it took to create these images in the first place. This inner chamber sits well beyond the cave's entrance passage, deep enough that anyone working here had to travel deliberately through total darkness just to reach the walls at all. There was no natural light this far in, not even filtered daylight. Every single mark on that stone was made by the unsteady flicker of a hand-carried flame, in a space cold, silent, and completely cut off from the rest of the world. Whoever painted these bison was not performing for an audience. There was no gallery, no ceremony that outsiders could witness, no one waiting to applaud the finished work. They walked into the absolute dark, on purpose, carrying fire, to leave something behind that they may never have expected anyone else to ever see again. Think about what that actually says about the impulse behind it. This was not decoration in any casual sense. It took genuine effort, real risk, and real intention to reach this exact spot and do this exact work, over and over, across what appears to have been multiple separate visits spanning a considerable stretch of time. But the paintings, remarkable as they are, turned out to be only one layer of what this cave actually preserved. As excavation continued across subsequent seasons, researchers began uncovering something in the sediment beneath the painted chamber that mattered just as much to science as the artwork above it. Layered physical evidence of long-term habitation, stretching back across an extraordinary span of time. And within those layers sat a detail that elevated Saint-Emilion from a simply beautiful painted cave into one of the genuinely rare sites in the archaeological record. The stratified layers beneath the cave floor showed clear evidence that this space had been used and reused, not by one group of people at one point in time, but by two entirely different populations of humans, separated from each other by thousands of years. The older layers point toward Neanderthal presence, evidence of a species that occupied this same sheltered ground long before the paintings on the walls were ever made. And sitting above those older layers, unmistakably later, the evidence shifts to anatomically modern humans, the same broad population responsible for the artwork itself. Sites where both of these populations can be clearly documented occupying the exact same physical space, even if separated by enormous stretches of time, are genuinely uncommon anywhere in the archaeological world. Saint-Emilion is one of them. Picture what that actually means laid out in the ground beneath your feet. Two fundamentally different kinds of human being, each one finding their own reasons to shelter inside this same stretch of stone, each one leaving behind their own quiet trace of having been there, completely unaware of the other, separated not by miles, but by an almost unimaginable depth of time. That overlap, sitting quietly in the sediment of a single Basque cave, turns out to be a small, physical echo of something far larger happening across the entire region during that same era, a pattern researchers would only be able to fully understand once they stopped looking at any one cave in isolation and started looking at the whole landscape surrounding it instead. To understand why a single cave in the Basque Country could hold two different species of human, you have to zoom out from Saint-Emilion entirely and look at the wider region it sits inside, because this corner of the map turns out to be one of the strangest and most important stretches of ground in all of Ice Age Europe. During the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets buried much of the continent and turned huge stretches of it into an uninhabitable wasteland, the Franco-Cantabrian region, the coastal band running from northern Spain into southwestern France remained something genuinely different. It functioned as a refuge, a livable pocket where plants, animals, and people could continue to survive while the rest of Europe froze around them. Researchers consider it one of the most densely populated glacial refuges anywhere on the continent, a narrow strip of habitable land that effectively became a lifeboat for an entire ecosystem, humans included. The earliest evidence of modern humans reaching the northern Iberian Peninsula dates back roughly 42,000 years, arriving from further east and gradually spreading westward into this fertile, ice-free corridor. Stone tools and the earliest signs of organized technology mark their path clearly enough for researchers to trace it with real confidence. But here is where the story turns genuinely strange, and it is a detail that most people have never heard. Neanderthal populations are well documented living in the southern portion of the Iberian Peninsula during this exact same period, specifically south of a natural landmark, the Ebro River. And despite modern humans having already arrived in the north, there is no evidence, none at all, of modern humans appearing south of that same river until 6,000 to 8,000 years after their initial arrival in the region. Sit with that gap for a moment, because it is enormous. 6,000 to 8,000 years is not a small delay. It is a length of time longer than the entire span of recorded human history. For thousands upon thousands of years, one river seems to have functioned as an actual boundary separating two different kinds of human being. Modern humans holding the north, Neanderthals holding the south, neither one crossing into the other's territory in any way archaeology has yet been able to detect. Think about what that would have actually felt like from the inside, generation after generation. Imagine being born into a world where a broad, unremarkable river marked the edge of everything you knew, and on the other side of it lived an entirely different kind of person, not a rival tribe speaking a different dialect, but a genuinely different species or subspecies of human altogether. And in the collective memory of your people, passed down through however many generations came before you, it had simply always been that way. There had always been another, sitting just across the water, and that arrangement held firm for thousands of years without apparently breaking down. What kind of territorial instinct does a divide like that carve into a people, held in place for that length of time? Nobody can answer that question with certainty, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What the evidence can say is only that the boundary existed, and that it held for a genuinely extraordinary stretch of time before it eventually gave way. But once that river boundary finally dissolved, and modern humans spread fully across the whole region, the story of who occupied this land did not simply settle into a single, unbroken population moving forward in a straight line. Instead, wave after wave of distinct cultures moved through this same Basque and Franco-Cantabrian landscape over the millennia that followed, each one identified today primarily by the particular way they shaped their stone tools, groups that archaeologists now refer to by names like the Mysterian and the Aurignacian, arriving from elsewhere and introducing new techniques, followed later by cultures that seem to have actually originated within this specific region itself. The Solitrian and the Azilian among them, spreading their own innovations back outward into the rest of Europe. The nomadic Magdalenian culture, emerging roughly 17,000 years ago, eventually spread its influence across nearly the entire continent, according to a wide body of archaeological evidence. Layer after layer, culture after culture, each one leaving its own mark on this same corner of the map. And through every single one of those waves, something in this particular region kept quietly staying different from everywhere else being reshaped around it. A pattern that would only grow stranger the deeper researchers eventually dug into it. Compared to much of the rest of Europe, agriculture and animal husbandry arrived in the Basque Country relatively late, taking hold in earnest around 8,000 years before the present. For a region that had spent tens of thousands of years shaped by hunting and gathering, this shift represented a genuine turning point, the slow beginning of a settled way of life built around herds and fields rather than following migrating game across the landscape. And the archaeological record shows exactly how that transition unfolded, one careful layer at a time. The very first domesticated animals to appear in burials from this period are, somewhat touchingly, companion dogs, animals kept close enough to their owners in life that they were buried alongside them in death. It is only in later excavations that the broader pattern of true animal husbandry becomes clear, with the remains of oxen, pigs, and early varieties of sheep and goats appearing across sites throughout the region, confirming that farming and herding had become a genuine, sustained part of daily existence, rather than a passing experiment. Alongside this shift toward settled life came an entirely new kind of monument, one that still marks the landscape today. Hundreds of dolmens and megaliths are scattered across Basque Country, many of them deliberately positioned on hilltops and exposed ridgelines where they would have been visible for a considerable distance in every direction. Some of these structures are unmistakably burial sites, built to hold and honor the dead. Others appear to carry a different kind of religious or ceremonial significance, purposes that remain only partially understood even now. And still others seem to serve no funerary or spiritual function at all, functioning instead as storage or shelter, or in some cases as deliberate boundary markers, physical lines in stone separating the territory claimed by one tribe from the land claimed by its neighbor. This is where the story folds directly back into caves like Santi Mamigne, and into countless sites very much like it's scattered throughout the same region. Because the same broad shift towards settled farming, herding, and permanent territorial boundaries also brought a renewed, different kind of use back into these ancient painted chambers. Long after the Magdalenian hunters who created the original artwork had vanished from the region entirely, new communities of farmers and herders returned to these same caves, this time not to paint, but to bury their dead. Neolithic and Bronze Age human remains, along with the accompanying pottery, tools, and personal ornaments typically placed alongside the deceased, have been found layered directly above the far older Paleolithic paintings and cave systems across the region, physical evidence stacked chapter upon chapter within the exact same stone passages. The same shelter that once held Ice Age hunters, gathering by torchlight, was later repurposed, generations upon generations afterward, as sacred ground for an entirely different kind of ceremony. It is worth being honest here about the current limits of that picture, because this register of investigation only works if the uncertainty gets stated plainly rather than smoothed over. Not every layer inside caves like this one has been fully excavated or precisely dated, and the researchers actively working these sites are explicit that there is still considerably more waiting to be uncovered beneath what has already been documented. This is not a closed case. It is an ongoing one, with new seasons of fieldwork still actively reshaping what is known. But even with those gaps still open, the broader pattern emerging from dolmens, from megaliths, and from these reused burial caves is already unmistakable enough to matter. This is the exact point where the story of the Basque Country stops being only about stone tools, painted walls, and buried bones, and starts becoming a story about identity itself, about a people slowly taking shape out of thousands of years of accumulated tradition on this same specific stretch of land. Because the descendants of the very communities leaving these graves in the ground would go on to become something that almost no other population in the whole of Europe managed to become across the millennia that followed. Nearly every other tribe, culture, and people across the continent was eventually reshaped, absorbed, or entirely replaced by the endless waves of migration, conquest, and mixing that defined European history again and again. The people who kept returning to bury their dead in these caves did not follow that same pattern. Somehow, against nearly every historical current running through the rest of the continent, they stayed remarkably, stubbornly unchanged. There is one detail about the Basque people that outlasts every dolmen, every burial layer, and every painted cave wall in this entire story, and it is something you can still hear spoken out loud today, in kitchens and classrooms and village squares across the region. Euskara, the Basque language, is what linguists call a true isolate, meaning it cannot be traced back to any other known language family on Earth. Every other major language spoken across Western Europe today, whether Spanish, French, German, or English, can ultimately be traced back through a documented family tree to a shared common ancestor. Euskara simply cannot. It stands entirely alone, with no confirmed living relatives anywhere on the planet. Today, roughly a quarter of the Basque population still speaks the language fluently, and the overwhelming majority of those speakers live on the Spanish side of the border rather than the French side, spread across several distinct regional dialects. Some of these dialects differ from one another significantly enough that speakers from different valleys can genuinely struggle to understand each other without effort, a level of internal variation that itself hints at just how long this language has been quietly developing in relative isolation, largely undisturbed by outside influence. To understand exactly how strange this is, you have to understand what being a true isolate actually means in practice. It is not simply that Euskara sounds different from its neighbors. It is that no linguist, working with any level of expertise, has ever been able to definitively link it to any other language family, living or dead, anywhere in the world. And that gap has not stopped people from trying, repeatedly, for well over a century. The proposed connections that have emerged over the years range from the mildly speculative all the way to the genuinely far-fetched. Some have claimed a link between the Basque people and figures from the Old Testament. Others have proposed a distant relationship to the Kartvelian language family of the Caucasus region in Georgia, or specifically to Chechen, whose underlying grammatical structure does bear a passing resemblance to Euskara's own. None of these theories have ever gathered the kind of solid, consistent evidence needed to move from speculation into genuine scientific consensus. Most rest on coincidence, on scattered fragments of similarity, or on the simple human desire to find a tidy explanation for something that has stubbornly refused to offer one. What makes this linguistic isolation even more remarkable is not simply that it exists, but that it has survived completely intact through an almost unbroken parade of powerful outside forces that reshaped nearly everything around it. Roman rule swept across the entire Iberian Peninsula and imposed Latin as the dominant language virtually everywhere it went, and yet failed to displace Euskara from the Basque heartland. The Visigoths later claimed the region and attempted to hold it, placing armed wardens along its borders specifically because they could not fully conquer the people living inside them. Charlemagne himself launched a deliberate, concerted campaign beginning in the 760s, specifically intended to force the pagan Basque population to convert to Christianity, centuries after most of the rest of Europe had already done so voluntarily. And even that campaign appears to have met only partial success, since surviving accounts from the same general period still describe Basque communities on the frontier continuing to practice their older polytheistic traditions well afterward. Centuries later, waves of Islamic rule swept across huge portions of the Iberian Peninsula to the south and held significant territory there for hundreds of years. And still, Euskara held its ground in the Basque heartland, untouched by Arabic in any lasting linguistic sense. Rome could not erase it. The Visigoths could not erase it. Charlemagne's armies could not fully erase it. Centuries of Islamic rule to the south could not erase it either. A language surviving that particular gauntlet of outside pressure fully intact across more than 1,000 years of continuous attempts to reshape the people who spoke it raises an obvious and pressing question that language alone was never going to be able to answer on its own. Not what the Basque people said to each other across all those centuries, but what their own bodies, at the deepest biological level, had actually been carrying the entire time. If a language could survive that many empires intact, the obvious next question was whether the biology underneath it told the same story. Starting in the early 2000s, a series of genetic studies set out to answer that question directly, and each new study built on the one before it, gradually sharpening a picture that started blurry and grew steadily more precise. The first major signal came in 2004 in a study published through Oxford Academic. Researchers were working to characterize the deep genetic history of European populations more broadly, and to do that properly, they needed a modern comparison point, a population whose genetics had changed as little as possible since the Neolithic period, so that older ancestral signals could be measured against something reasonably stable. The Basque population turned out to be one of the very few groups in all of Europe suited to that role, standing alongside a small handful of other isolated populations from North Africa, Sardinia, and the Near East. In other words, geneticists were already treating the Basque as a kind of living genetic time capsule, decades before the full picture came into focus. Then, in 2013, a mitochondrial DNA study published in the journal PLOS One examined female genetic lineages across the wider Franco-Cantabrian region specifically. The results were striking. Roughly 35% of those maternal lineages traced directly back to populations that predated the arrival of agriculture entirely, suggesting real, measurable genetic continuity stretching all the way back to the hunter-gatherer groups who had taken refuge in this exact region during the last ice age. This was not a population that had simply settled here recently. Their own mothers' mothers' mothers, traced back far enough, led directly into the deep ice age past of this specific landscape. 2 years later, in 2015, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined ancient DNA recovered from 8 human skeletons found in the El Portalón cavern at Atapuerca in northern Spain. These were Neolithic farmers who had lived roughly 3,500 to 1,500 years before the Common Era, and their genetic profile turned out to be a distinctive blend, early farmer ancestry mixed together with the genes of local Stone Age hunter-gatherers. When researchers compared that specific genetic mixture against modern European populations, the closest match, by a clear margin, was the Basque population living today. That result actually complicated the existing picture rather than simplifying it, since it suggested a much closer connection between the Basque and the very first farmers to reach the region than anyone had previously assumed. By 2017, a broader study published in PLOS Genetics extended the picture even further. Across much of Europe, later waves of migration from the Eurasian steppe had substantially reshaped local populations during the Bronze Age, introducing new genetic ancestry on a massive scale. But on the Iberian Peninsula specifically, and among Basque and Portuguese populations in particular, that same reshaping happened to a dramatically smaller degree. Genetically, these populations remained far closer to their Neolithic ancestors than almost anywhere else on the continent, a pattern the study's own authors noted explicitly stood in contrast to what had happened further north. All of that earlier research finally converged in a much higher resolution study published in the journal Current Biology. This effort analyzed 190 genetic samples collected from across both the French and Spanish sides of Basque Country, sequencing each one to characterize roughly 600,000 distinct genetic markers, by far the most detailed genetic survey of this population ever conducted. The results confirmed what decades of smaller studies had been circling around from different directions. The Basque are genuinely, measurably distinct from every neighboring European population, with an unusually fine-grained genetic structure that varies meaningfully from one individual village to the next. And across the entire genetic record the study examined, researchers could identify only 2 significant windows where any substantial outside genetic mixing occurred at all, both dated to sometime between the 11th and 16th centuries. Outside of those 2 narrow windows, the genetic record shows a population that had, for thousands of years, been left almost entirely to itself. This is not a story that ends with a solved mystery. It ends with a documented one that still refuses full explanation. A cave sealed by a mountain 13,000 years ago, reopened by accident, sitting inside a country whose language, genetics, and culture have resisted nearly every force that reshaped the rest of the continent. Roman legions could not erase it. Visigothic and Frankish wardens could not hold it. Centuries of Islamic rule to the south could not convert it. What survived instead is a population that is, by every modern genetic measure, one of the most singular in Europe, speaking a language still spoken exactly the way it always confused every empire that ever tried to replace it. Subscribe for the next investigation, and I will see you in the next one.